Alright, hello and welcome again to the primary weapon review for 2018. DE has released a significant balance pass, changing the values on most primary weapons in the game, which necessitates another primary review this year. So, before we get into this, let's talk about the ranks, as there is always some confusion. First and foremost, at the bottom is the starter ranking. This is to reduce the amount of comments that would freak out if I called the Boltor good. And it is basically only for anyone that is going to look at a list and be like, man, this guy thinks the Bratton is a good weapon, and leave their inane comment. That is what the starter classification is for, to reduce the amount of shit comments like that. Beyond that, we have MR fodder. These are the actually bad weapons that are poor for when you are able to get them. Accessibility does matter in my ranking list, because if you can't fucking acquire something, it doesn't matter if it's good for being MR4. Looking at you, Bratton Vandal. With that, we are moving on to the categories that people care about, which is the good category. These are solid weapons. For whenever you're able to acquire them, they will serve you well, and if you enjoy them, they're perfectly serviceable. Beyond that, we have the great category. These weapons are outstanding, and a lot of them are all fighting for the number 10 slot in the top 10. So, obviously, beyond great, we have the top 10 itself, which are the 10 weapons that I believe to be the 10 best primary weapons currently in the game. I will say, as I said in the great category, this list was hard to make. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of really, really solid primary weapons right now. So if yours is in the great category and not in the top 10, honestly, at this point, it might be just a little bit to taste, with some minor possible exceptions. Anyway, I hope that has explained the ranks well enough, and I know it will not prevent some people not understanding that availability matters in this game, but let's just get into this. Okay, first and foremost, we have the Amprex, which takes its slot in the top 10 as number 3. The Amprex is an absolutely tremendously powerful weapon, and is, in my opinion, the best beam weapon currently in the game. It has incredible damage, super high crit, it has immense status, and it is purely elemental, meaning that whatever status you build on this, it's going to apply to everything it touches in its very, very respectable AoE. Of course, this weapon did eat a nerf whenever they made it so that it can't chain for entire tile sets worth of range. However, that has not stopped it from being a complete powerhouse that can wipe out anything that it touches. Whether you need to apply viral to an entire room while you're murdering them, or strip the armor off of a bunch of bombards, the Amprex can do all of it and more. It's a very impressive weapon and is the pinnacle of the beam rework. So, moving on. Next up, we have the Arcaplasmor. The Arcaplasmor is a great weapon, but it's not making the top 10. This weapon still has the ability to clear out very large groups of enemies and be incredibly powerful, but since it's nerf, it's really missing that special something that could get it onto the top 10, but of course, it's in the great category for a reason. And now we have the Argonac. So the Argonac, surprisingly, is in the good category. This weapon for an MR7 is actually incredibly potent. It's got the full auto mode, which applies decent status, and its semi-auto doesn't do horrible DPS. Combine that with it coming with a V and a dash polarity, and you get a weapon that performs far above what it probably realistically should be doing for an MR7 weapon. So if you're looking for something semi-auto that is still actually good, you're looking for this. Alright, next up we have the Astela. The Astela was previously on my top 10, but has now fallen to only great. This weapon is still phenomenal. It does great AoE damage. It's very unique and can be built a variety of ways and be very successful. It is not a difficult to build weapon. It just has a lot going for it overall. And if you'd like a unique weapon, this is a mid-range explosive shotgun, which is a bit out of the ordinary. The Attica. So, the Attica, much like the Argonac, performs incredibly well for being MR7. If you have the ability to access this weapon, as it is slightly more expensive than the Argonac, it will serve you very, very well, and even though it is fully automatic, this weapon is still considered a bow for the purposes of bow-only sorties, so for those of you looking to not use, say, the Paris or other slow-firing weapons, you can fall back on this if you just want to stick to your machine guns. Moving on, we have the Baza, which comes in at number 8 on my top 10 list. So this weapon is absolutely incredible, and it shreds enemies like nobody's business. It has fall off because it is an SMG starting at 22 meters away, but honestly, you could probably shoot someone a couple planets away and still kill them, considering this weapon's immense damage that it has, and its absolutely incredible accuracy. Couple that with this weapon's niche in being the absolute best weapon you could ever equip on a Navarra, who is an amazing Warframe, and this weapon just has a whole lot going for it, and it's absolutely worth it at MR7. It is outstanding. Alright, moving out of this opening praise, we have the regular bore. So the regular bore is unfortunately MR fodder. I know I've called this weapon better in the past, but I think that's just because I do really enjoy the bore. But on a realistic note, you're not actually going to have access to this weapon when it's any use to you. So yeah, it's just MR fodder. The Bore Prime. So, much like its regular counterpart, this weapon is usually going to come into play after you don't really have much use for it. That being said, the Bore Prime is a good weapon. It competes, it's solid enough. I personally don't feel like you're actually going to have access to this weapon when it is at its best, which would be like right when you get to MR11, but if you get this weapon later down the line and you really like the Bore series, you just love how this weapon looks, it will serve you well after you've invested the forma into it. The Boltor. So the Boltor, like we said in the opening, this is a starter weapon. You're going to get this blueprint for free from one of the junctions, and there's no reason not to build this thing. It will serve you well as a new player. The Boltor Prime. So once upon a time, this was the best weapon in the game. That, unfortunately, is no longer, and this weapon is only good. There's some merit to be had with this weapon, but being a puncture-based status weapon as it stands now is just really not very useful, and while its, like, just main bulk of damage is okay, it's really nothing to write home about, especially considering the other Boltor variant that is available, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Moving on, we have another starter weapon. There's no real reason to not pick this up, but it's nothing special either. If you're a new player, you're going to want to work through this and grab the mastery from it, and it will serve you well while you're doing that. The Bratton Prime. So the Bratton Prime is good in a different way than the Boltor Prime is. This weapon is not as good as the Boltor Prime is, but this weapon is very, very accessible. It's basically worth nothing. If you're MR8, you can fucking get a hold of a Bratton Prime, and it will be solid for being MR8. So, if you really enjoy the Bratton series, you will have a good time with this weapon. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we have the Bratton Vandal, which is an MR4 weapon, and if you could actually fucking acquire it in MR4, I'd probably tell you this was great. But you can't. This comes from Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. That is level 100 plus content that no one at MR4 should be doing, and this weapon has, like, each of its parts at, like, a 2% drop rate each. So, basically, fuck off. This weapon is terrible for when you're gonna get it. The regular Burstin. I'd very much like to tell you this is a starter weapon, but it's not even good enough for me to tell you that. The Burstin Prime. So, a good augment is no longer saving this weapon, and it is unfortunately MR fodder. The Buzzlock. So, this is a gimmick weapon. It is good. From a strictly test perspective, it is good for its MR. However, I hate this weapon. I cannot fucking stand this thing. It has bullets that are slower than fucking walking, and it has a terrible, terrible reload. If this thing couldn't give itself 50% additive crit with its alt fire, I would garbage dump this. That being said, if you really love its gimmick, it does technically work. The regular Ceranos is not worth using. This is a bad bow. Ceranos Prime, on the other hand, is solid. It's good for its rank of MR12, and if you want to be Ivara when your other Warframes, this can technically pretty much do that for you, so go nuts. The Convectrix. So, initially I was under the impression that this weapon might be able to be saved by the beam rework. I was absolutely fucking wrong. This weapon might have trouble cutting a pizza. It's garbage. The Corinth. So, unfortunately, I very much overrated this weapon in my previous primary review. I was definitely living off some of the release hype of this weapon, but now that that has calmed down, it is very plain to see that this weapon just doesn't really suit how we fight in Warframe. Even with punch through, this weapon is just a bit too slow, and while it does sufficient enough damage, it's not so sufficient that it can really be above the good ranking for an MR10 weapon, which is really sad because this weapon sounds incredible. The Daikyu. This weapon is at MR10. It performs about as well as a weapon at MR3, let's say. It's complete garbage. The Dara, an incredibly expensive weapon that wants a lot of investment from you, none of which is worth it. MR fodder. The Dara Vandal. It is a slightly better, much harder to acquire Dara. It's terrible. MR fodder. The Dexiberus. So the Dexiberus is a good weapon, and depending on when you start playing Warframe, it could even be a great weapon. If you get this in the early days of playing Warframe, you're going to have a fantastic time with it, but metering it out for when I think someone is likely to get this, it's probably just going to be solid or good. The Dragoon. It's a clunky shotgun with a neat augment, but realistically just turn this thing into a fucking czar and get it over with. The Dread. So the Dread is Stalker's most common weapon drop, and it fucking only requires Mastery Rank 5, which is absolutely ridiculous given the amount of damage this weapon can pump out. And now that they halved its charge rate, it can kick out that damage at a significantly faster rate. And it's slash-based, which is just the gravy. The Ferox. So the Ferox also, much like the Astela, previously made it into my top 10, but I can see now that so much of that was actually my personal bias, and this weapon, especially at MR14, is only good. It's really unfortunate that its MR is as such, but that's just how it has to be. The Flux Rifle, an interesting weapon. The changes that they made to it are curious, to say the least, but useless still. The Glaxion. So, as much as I'd like to say that this weapon will turn you into Mr. Freeze, it will actually only really turn you into Mr. About Room Temperature, so it's worthless. The regular Gorgon. So, it's low mastery rank, but it's really not even worth that. It's just too many downsides in a weapon with no real upsides. The Gorgon Wraith. So, the Gorgon Wraith actually performs okay, but it's not really worth investing in at all due to the presence of the Prisma Gorgon existing, which we'll talk about when we get there. The Grakata. So what used to be an early game monster for new players is unfortunately now Master Rank 5, and while you definitely can make this work, by that time you already have a fully functioning Heck, or at least you should. So it's not as good as it once was. The Grinlock. So there are a lot of very good options for you to get at Master Rank 7. The Grinlock is not one of them. Master Rank fodder. The Harpack is one of those Master Rank 7 weapons that is actually worth getting. This weapon has a unique gimmick in that it can pull enemies towards you, which is occasionally useful, but mostly this weapon just does solid enough damage, and that's going to get you through a good amount of content. I will say that this weapon is kind of barely cutting it on the good list, and that's mostly because it is just so cheap to make. But for those of you that want the harpoon feature, you're definitely going to really enjoy this thing. The Heck. So it should come at no surprise that this weapon is great. It is the de facto, a new player just got to MR4. What do I build? You build a Heck. This weapon will destroy all foes that come your way anywhere on the star chart. If you pick up a Heck and you put mods into it, it will kill your enemies. It's as simple as that. If you don't have a Heck, you need one. Go get it. The Hema. So the Hema actually comes with a pretty specific caveat in that no matter what, if you are in a clan that doesn't already have this researched, don't fucking bother. However, if you do have it researched already, or you're joining a clan that does, this weapon is good. It has lifesteal, it has technically unlimited ammo because it takes your health in order to reload and then it heals you, and it has very solid status, and it's great in combination with Warframes like Ignace, who don't really need the damage, they mostly just need status application to strip armor and such, and this thing is viral innately, which is a bonus. So, provided you can actually get access to this weapon, it will serve you well as a tool from time to time in specific scenarios. The Hind. As many of you know from my previous review, this weapon is absolute trash garbage, and I think it's getting a little moldy, so let's get out of here. The regular Ignace. Unfortunately, this weapon is made completely obsolete by its better, which is the Ignace Wraith, which comes in at number 4 on my top 10. Much like the Amprex, this boasts AoE, good status, crit stats. It's got a lot going for it, and it is definitely worth investing the 5 forma that this thing wants at the current time. Also, just because this is actually worth noting, its ammo economy is ridiculously efficient. The Javelock. So the Javelock, after, like, basically running the numbers, let's say, it's just not worth the farm. Like, spending the time to get the unique parts this weapon needs to build it is just not worthwhile, and unfortunately it can be avoided unless you're looking to do a gimmicky build on Ember, but Ember got nerfed, so, you know. The regular Karak, it's Mastery Rank 1, but honestly, like, you're not going to do this for anything but Mastery. The Karak Wraith, it's not available until you already have things that are better than it, so unfortunately, this is also MR fodder. The Comb, so by default, this weapon is good, and this is the only weapon where it is worth mentioning that if you have a good Riven for it, it becomes the single best weapon in the entire game. This is the only time I'm going to mention Rivens on this list, and it has not changed the rank of this weapon at all, because it is a good weapon, even as it stands. But yeah, if you have a Riven for it and it's rolled right, it's literally the best weapon in the game. The Lanka. So the Lanka is a great weapon. It is it's the go-to for Eidolon hunting at the current time. It does a lot of fucking damage, and the only reason this isn't making the top 10 is that it's kind of just a little too slow for most normal content. You can charge it halfway, but there are a lot of snipers that are just better than it for general gameplay that can also be used for Eidolon hunting, albeit not as well. Still doesn't change that this weapon is great. Okay, let's get into some junk. This doesn't even have a mastery rank requirement, and it's still not worth building. Absolute garbage. Much like its regular variant, this weapon is not worth it. This weapon would maybe be worth it if it was 5 MR lower than it currently is. The Latron Wraith and the Latron Prime are incredibly comparable, which means this should probably be about 2 MR earlier than it is. Finally, we can stop talking about trash and talk about the lens instead. So the lens is an absolutely incredible AoE clear monster. If you would like to blow some shit up, then look no further. This is an incredible weapon that you fire it into an area, it freezes all enemies, and then it kills them all with a big explosion. It's quite nice. The MITRE. So if any weapon has gone underappreciated, it's the MITRE. This weapon can actually scale really well with the right build and can pretty easily dispatch level 100 enemies. So I know this is only an MR6 weapon, but honestly, don't overlook this thing. It's better than what you can build it into, that being the Panthera. Mark 1 Breton, not really worth mentioning, you can start with this weapon. Mark 1 Paris, much in the same vein, you can start with this, they're not really that different. The Mark 1 Stron, you can't start with this, making this hard MR fodder. The Mutalist Ceranos, so it would be very easy for me to just call this weapon MR fodder, but at MR7, this weapon actually performs quite well, and its AoE effect and good status actually work out quite well. So if you're into spreading status everywhere with a really gross looking weapon, look no further, especially if you also like bows. The Mutalist Quanta, on the other hand, did not really share the same fate. This weapon is really bad, and even though this weapon is adorable in that it helps you reload with the little gross part, it's just not worth using. The Ogress. Why is this weapon mastery rank 9? It does not even come close to being worth that. The Opticore, on the other hand, is somewhat justifying itself at mastery rank 14. I would probably say this weapon would be more worthwhile at MR 12, but honestly, once you're that high up in MR, you're more so looking for tools, and if you need a giant fucking base cannon to kill anything you look at, you're looking at this. The Panthera. So if me talking about the MITRE didn't give it away, this weapon is bad, and you really don't want to build the MITRE into this. The Parasist. It's like a Harpack at the exact same MR and way more fucking expensive, making it not worthwhile at all. MR fodder. The regular Paris. Also MR fodder, unfortunately. The Paris Prime. So unfortunately, this weapon is now MR 8. However, in the event that you do not get the Dread first, this weapon is good, and it will serve you well. It's very, very common also, so if you're MR8, you can definitely get a hold of it. No questions asked. The Penta, a very dangerous weapon that's not really worthwhile, and that's in part due to its much better variant. The Phage. So I want to like this weapon, but it's honestly like 4 or 5 MR too high for me to call this weapon anything but a meme. If you want to tentacles enemies to death, this will do that. The Prisma Gorgon. So the Prisma Gorgon is actually great. This is the weapon that is making everything else in the Gorgon series pretty much completely irrelevant, and this is actually worth investing in, given that you come across it at its master rank. If you're like a little bit too far beyond this weapon, say if you're like at MR 15 and you kind of have access to all of the other fully automatic crit weapons, it's gonna be a hard sell for you to invest in this thing whenever it comes around on borrow. But it performs very, very well, and there's not much more to be said than that. The Prisma Gorgon, much like the Prisma Gorgon, it performs incredibly well, and it is a fully automatic crit primary. It's fantastic. This was previously, of course, on the top 10. It has not gotten any worse. So, yeah, definitely still great. The Prisma Tetra. So, unfortunately, we, of course, have to have the ugly child of the Prisma weaponry. This weapon says MR4 on it, but it is very expensive and comes from Katir. So, the likelihood that an MR4 is actually going to get a hold of this thing is incredibly low, making this weapon absolute garbage. The regular Quanta. This weapon is only MR4, but this requires 7 Fieldron and a Forma? What the fuck is that? Much easier to acquire, doesn't cost a fucking arm and a leg, comes at a higher master rank, but it's also a strictly better weapon. This weapon is actually worth getting, and I would call it good. Previously I would call it great, but the power level of the game has just moved up a little bit. The Core Attack. I'm as shocked as you to hear this, probably, but this weapon is actually great. How it functions was completely changed like 3 or 4 times, and it actually came out on the other end really well. So, this is kind of the use for that Ghouls event that won't stop fucking coming back. The Rakta Ceranos. Also great, and definitely my personal favorite bow. This weapon is absolutely incredible. It provides energy for you, and it fires incredibly fast. But that incredible fast fire rate is, of course, slightly less valuable now that a lot of the other bows got buffed. That being said, it's absolutely fantastic. If you can get a hold of this thing, do so. The Rubik. So, surprise, surprise, this weapon is MR6, and it comes in at number 6 on my top 10. This weapon, after it got buffed to have a less shitty reload, it just does so much damage. Like, it just hurts so much. You can get it so early, and it's just worthwhile. Like, if you don't mind the reload, or you even want to build around it, you can put a reload mod in this weapon, and it will still do enough damage to kill pretty much anything you're likely to encounter. And, in addition to that, if you want to get into Eidolon hunting earlier than the Lanka is available, this is kind of the go-to. There's a lot of positive things to be said about the Rubik. So yeah, there it is. It's number 6. The Sancti Tigris. So this weapon comes in at MR12, which is just too close to its bigger brother, the Tigris Prime. And in addition to that, this is a new Loka exclusive weapon, so if you're not in New Loka, you're going to have to trade for it, and that's really, really not worth it, considering just how accessible the Tigris Prime is at the current time. If the Tigris Prime ever becomes not super fucking common, and it's about to get vaulted, I know, this weapon will be a little bit better, but for right now, it's just not worth it. The Scourge, another weapon that I would love to like, but it really just doesn't do anything, even for MR6. Mastery fodder. The Sakura Penta. So the Sakura Penta was buffed very, very significantly in the balance pass, enough that I'll call it good at this point. It's definitely the best launcher currently in the game, considering the Tonker got nerfed into the fucking ground. And if you're looking for a launcher to use, this is definitely the one I would suggest, especially if you're a mag player, because this weapon actually has a unique synergy with mag in that it will decimate the shit out of anything present in her 2, as long as it's not like level 1000. So yeah. Quite good. The regular Simulor is absolute garbage. The regular Snipetron, you're definitely not going to have access to this before it's absolutely useless to you. Hey look, that thing I just said, but again. The Sobek. So, this weapon is drastically overhyped. It is good. It is a good weapon, but it's definitely not this like amazing infinite scaling thing that it sometimes gets cracked up to be because of its augment. It's solid. You can definitely use it. It'll take you places, but we definitely need a Sobek Wraith. The Soma for MR6, this is solid. The Soma has received a lot of power creep, and this and its Prime are both only good. I know that's kind of crazy because the Soma Prime is vaulted, but they're both just solid weapons. There's not really anything more to be said. These weapons obviously used to be the best in the game at one point, but that's just not true anymore. The Stradivar also, at this point, quite good. Actually better than the Somas, I think. Which I know is probably kind of surprising, but yeah, the buffs to this weapon have been significant, and it's definitely worth building. Regular Stron, definitely MR fodder. On the other hand, the Stron Wraith is absolutely fantastic and comes in at number 9 on my top 10. This weapon hits pretty hard and has 100% status. The one big downside this weapon has is that reloading it can be kind of a son of a bitch, but I think that might just be me personally in that I hate the way it reloads, and it's not actually that slow, and its reload style has some little advantages here and there. So, if you're looking for a shotgun, this is a very solid one to get, and it is not particularly difficult to get a hold of. The regular Supra. So unfortunately, the regular Supra is just at too high of an MR to make it worth investing in at all, given that the Supra Vandal exists. The Supra Vandal comes in at number 5 on the top 10. This weapon boasts it all. It has crit, it has status, it gives you energy, it never runs out of fucking ammo, you can shoot it for 1,000,000 years, it fucks nullifiers up. It just goes, and it just goes, and it just goes. This weapon is absolutely incredible, and I'm gonna be real honest, I'm probably ranking this like 1 or 2 places higher than it probably should be. But this weapon's so fucking good, and I love it. The regular Superest at MR5? Absolutely solid. I think that you'd probably be better off sticking with a Heck, but for those of you that are not going to be into shotguns, this is definitely a great alternative to get shortly after you're able to acquire the Heck. The Superest Prime. So the Superest Prime barely falling out of the top 10 is just a great weapon now. This weapon is still incredibly powerful, but unfortunately the Tiburon Prime exists now, and while I like this weapon better, the Tiburon Prime statistically performs better. The Synapse. So the Synapse is good, but the Amprex exists. That's kind of the biggest downside to the Synapse, is that it's very, very similar to what the Amprex is going to be capable of, but the Amprex is kind of just better in every way that's meaningful. That doesn't mean that this weapon is awful. It's good, but it's just not doing quite enough for what current beam weapons are. The Sinoid Simulor, once one of the best weapons in the game, not so much anymore. Definitely MR fodder. The Telos Boltor, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I would actually consider this weapon to be great. It's definitely the best of all of the current Boltors that exist in the game, but I will say the thing that is pushing it into the great category is this weapon's ability to heal you at a pretty constant pace and do AoE damage. So take that with what you will. The Tenora is also a great weapon. It is a crit-based automatic rifle. Another one. The regular Tetra, you thought the Prisma was bad. This is garbage. The Tiburon is no longer worth investing in. Its master rank is definitely too high for that because it's so close to its big brother. Its big brother, of course, being the Tiburon Prime. So this weapon is very solid. It's a good all-arounder, and it comes in at number 10 on my top 10. It's solid. There's no real bad points to be said about this weapon. If a weakness of one mode is patched up by the strengths of another usually, and it's solid, it just doesn't really do nearly as much as the Super Vandal, and that's kind of the main downside of this thing. The regular Tigris is solid enough for MR7, but honestly, I'm barely calling this thing good. And I would highly advise that you just stick to your Heck instead. The Tigris Prime, of course, retaining its number 1 slot on my top 10. This weapon's just destructive. You shoot it down a hallway and you accidentally get like 30 kills. That's just what happens. Like, it does so much damage. It's such significant overkill for just all of the realistic content anyone's playing in the game, and it just obliterates. Also, if you're not using Seeking Fury on this weapon, what are you doing with your life? The Tonkor. I know it's only MR5, but honestly, this weapon was nerfed so much that it's just really not even worth investing in at all anymore. Torrid surprisingly comes in at only MR4, and while this weapon is a bit hard to build for that rank, even slightly after you meet the requirements for this weapon, it'll do you some solid stuff. It has okay status, it has good AoE, and it can actually kill some stuff. Properly invested in, this weapon can actually be used in some further levels to lock down areas from fodder enemies and just have enemies die as they walk into the smog. So, it's good. It's solid enough. Now we have the Vacor Heck. So the Vacor Heck comes in at number 7 on my top 10. This weapon just does a lot of fucking damage. It's really convenient to use. It's got a good repeat fire. Its reload's not too long. There's just a lot of real good stuff to say about this thing. It's just so much more usable, and it's also strictly better with the Prime mods for shotguns than the regular Heck. It's just got a lot going for it. The regular Vectis. So, this weapon is great. It's MR2. It's so easy to build. This is an MR2 weapon you can use for literally all of the content in the entire game, which I guess makes it pretty obvious why the Vectis Prime comes in at number 2 on my top 10. The Vectis Prime is a better version of the regular Vectis, and it just fucking kills everything, man. Like, nothing can really stand in the way of this thing. The Lanka is better for hunting Eidolons, but that's all it's better for. this thing just demolishes. If you need to bring something to a sniper-only sortie, you're bringing this thing, or you want to be bringing this thing. It's absolutely incredible. If you want to use a sniper rifle on regular enemies in the game, look no further. This is the thing. The Velt. This weapon got an entire video about how it's not worth it for its MR, so you can imagine it's master rank fodder. The Valkare. I know this weapon is basically handed to you for free, but honestly it's MR fodder even for that. The Valkare Wraith. I'm going to call this weapon good, and I can see why people might say that this would belong in great, but I absolutely hate the coin flipping nature of this weapon, and literally, hey, the Vectis, the regular one, it exists, it's MR2. And also, the Rubik exists. Yeah, that's also a thing. So, the Valkare Wraith is very serviceable, it's good, but come on, there are so many better options. The Tsar. This is what you should turn the Dragoon into. It is a very, very solid launcher, and while I think that the Sakura Penta is actually a little bit better than it, this still performs very, very well, especially for MR7. The Zenith. So the Zenith is very, very good. Not that you're going to have access to it within your first, year of playing Warframe. But hey, if you eventually get it ever, it's worth investing in. It's great. And finally, we have the Zouge. So the Zouge is the other repeat fire crossbow besides the Attica. It is good for bow-only sorties, and it's kind of just really good in general. This weapon is fantastic, and if you're not enjoying any of the Boltor variants, maybe try this, as it's kind of similar. But yeah, that is actually going to wrap it up for the primary review. I'm going to go spend many hours editing this, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I will see you tomorrow.